Hello class and welcome back. So for today's lesson, we're going to be delving into one of the instances when the Cold War truly turns hot, and that is going to be in the case of Korea. So please title your notes for today, The Korean War. So, just as a little bit of recap, don't forget that for about 30 years, the Korean Peninsula was controlled by the Japanese. It was one of their imperial colonies, one of their imperial interests in Asia during their expansion. Now that World War II has come to an end, though, a bit of a power vacuum is going to open in that region, and you're going to see that in several parts of the world, there's going to be the competing ideologies of communism and capitalism clashing and ultimately creating a divide. In the case of East and West Berlin, in the case of North and South Vietnam, in the case of North and South Korea. So you'll see that in this case, the United States is going to be largely promoting capitalism in the South, where China and the Soviet Union are going to be largely promoting communism in the North. So the cases of Korea and Vietnam are largely known as the moments when the Cold War turns hot in what are known as proxy conflicts. So if you don't know what a proxy conflict is, it's essentially a conflict between two different sides, but they're not really the ones pulling the strings. There are larger puppeteers behind the scenes who are really the ones in control making the decisions. In this case, it's the United States and the Soviet Union. So by 1949, about 4 years after World War II, the US and the USSR had largely pulled their troops off the Korean Peninsula. Don't forget the goal of the post-war settlement, as made at Yalta, was to temporarily be monitoring these regions and ultimately give them their autonomy. So what starts to happen, though, is the Soviets start to play their political cards. They don't think the United States is going to defend the South, and they of course want to expand their interests and their power as far as they can. So they start giving the North Koreans tanks and airplanes and military technology and money, of course with the intention that if the North becomes more powerful, they'll invade and take over the South and ultimately spread communism. So this becomes an ultimate test for the new peacekeeping organization, the United Nations. So by June of 1950, North Korea launched its first surprise attack on the South, and they officially invade over the 38th parallel, the line that really divided the two different sides. So now don't forget, the United States' official policy when dealing with international issues of the spread of communism is containment. It's really important that you understand where in time you are. This is right after World War II. You'll see that the US policy is going to evolve over time, and it's going to be more about getting involved firsthand, but at this point, it's just about containing communism. And this becomes the ultimate test. Can the United States prevent communism from creeping from North Korea into South Korea? It's going to really come down to the UN as well. The League of Nations proved to largely be a massive failure after World War I. Think of the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, the rape of Nanking, the Mukden incident, where the Japanese basically launched an explosion on a railway line themselves, and then used that as an excuse to invade. And the League of Nations really did nothing in Asia. The UN is going to want to step up very quickly, so they immediately send an intervention force to put down the invasion. Interestingly, the meeting where this intervention plan is created, the USSR does not attend. Why? Because they're the ones who are actually promoting this invasion behind the scenes. But what's really important to remember, don't forget, there's a permanent coalition secretary of those five different nations that can veto any decision made, but because the USSR does not attend the meeting, they can't use their veto to prevent the intervention plan from taking effect. So just to show you this on a map, the North Koreans are going to invade into the South and then push the South Koreans to this very, very small tip here, okay? So now stay with me. The UN is going to arrive, and their operation is going to be led by someone you should be familiar with, Douglas MacArthur. Don't forget, he was one of the leading commanders in the Pacific during World War II, and he's going to be overseeing this operation. Under his leadership, the North Koreans retreat, and they get pushed all the way up past the 38th parallel to the Yalu River, which is really, really close to China. So I'm just going to go back to that map for 1 second just to show you. The Yalu River is right about here. So you can see that this is the natural boundary between China and the Korean Peninsula. So now if the North Koreans are getting pushed back all the way up there, who is going to feel threatened? China. So now don't forget, China is also a communist country by this point. Mao Zedong has largely taken authority there. So now you're going to have the Chinese actually invade on behalf of the North Koreans. So a lot of different players are getting sucked into this confrontation. So, of course, because China feels threatened, they send 300,000 troops to force the UN out of North Korea, and they're going to be successful. They push them back into South Korea, and you're going to see they basically get stopped again at the 38th parallel. This becomes a defining moment in Douglas MacArthur's career. He pleads with President Truman to use another nuclear weapon against North Korea the same way the US used the atomic bombs against Japan. Truman refuses, though, and says this is too extreme of a measure to take, and MacArthur makes a fateful decision. He basically goes around Truman and lobbies to congressmen and talks to the press and tells them how necessary an atomic bomb would be in this instance. And it's, such an obvious sign of going, against the president that Truman has no choice but to remove him from power. So it's kind of like a dark stain on the end of MacArthur's career. So ultimately, the war kind of comes to an end with very little actually accomplished. And you can kind of see the trajectory of the war in that GIF over there to the right. But by 1953, about 3 years into the war, a ceasefire is drawn up and the border is returned to the 38th parallel where it was originally. So neither side technically gained anything, but didn't they? Don't forget, the US policy at this point in time is containment. And really, if you're just looking at it through that lens, Truman is successful in containing communism to the north. Another invisible show of how the United States and the capitalist West is preventing the Soviet Union from expanding their authority. Interestingly, because only a ceasefire was signed and not an actual treaty, in terms of war strategy, North and South Korea are still technically at war with each other even in modern day. They're not really fighting with each other, but the border is still heavily patrolled, and on paper, they're still technically at war. Just to show you very quickly the trajectory of the war, so you have North Korea surprise attacking the south and pushing them to the very southern tip of the peninsula. The UN arrives and they push the North Koreans all the way up to the Yalu River. Feeling threatened, the Chinese get involved and they send 300,000 troops to defend North Korea. They push them back, and then ultimately the 30th parallel becomes the border between these two places. Going forward, we have two more hotbeds to talk about, critical moments during the Cold War, where things are going to become hot and we're going to get really close to a direct confrontation with the Soviet Union. The first instance in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then ultimately the Vietnam War.